The Sethali Observer arrived on a Tuesday, which is relevant only because Tuesday is the day I do my requisition audit. And she walked in while I had 300 paper forms spread across every flat surface in the supply cage and a grease pencil behind each ear. Her name was Velanath. I learned that from the briefing sheet Colonel Marin sent down the morning before. The sheet said she was an Accord observer, embedded by treaty, one of 47 Sethali assigned to forward installations across the Vara theater, and that she was here to document resource allocation behavior in human military units. The briefing sheet said to afford her full access within operational security constraints and to answer her questions honestly. It also said she would not interfere, would not eat our food, and would not require sleeping quarters because she rested in a state that looked like standing with her eyes half closed, and not to be alarmed by it. I was not alarmed by it. I had been running supply for 9 years across 4 postings, and I had learned that things that seemed alarming from a distance were usually just things you hadn't cataloged yet. The alarm is almost always a classification problem rather than a safety problem, and classification problems yield to patience and honest observation the way most problems do if you apply enough of both. The Sethali are tall. Velanath cleared the door frame of the supply cage by about 2 centimeters, which I noticed because I had hit that frame with a pallet corner the month before, and it had left a dent I kept meaning to report. She was thin the way a measuring rod is thin, built for precision rather than mass, with skin that was a consistent pale gray that caught the afternoon light through the corrugated roof panels and gave it back with a faint iridescence, like water held in a shallow bowl under indirect sunlight. 4 fingers on each hand, eyes that were a very deep amber with no discernible pupil until the light hit them at the right angle, at which point you could see the pupil was enormous and vertical. She wore an Accord observer's sash burgundy with a white diagonal stripe over a garment that looked more like a second skin than clothing, matte gray-green, no visible seams or fastenings. No equipment I could see. No data pad, no recorder. Whatever she used to document, she kept inside herself. She stood in the doorway of the supply cage for approximately 4 seconds without speaking. I said, "Come in or stay out. There's a draft either way." She came in. She looked at the forms on the tables and the shelves and the floor and the 3 stacked crates I was using as a secondary surface. She looked at them the way a surveyor looks at terrain, not judging it, just mapping it, filing the distances and the densities. "You are the resource allocation specialist," she said. Her standard was clean and nearly unaccented, which the briefing sheet had not mentioned. "Supply Sergeant," I said. "Dale Vaughn, Sergeant First Class if you're tracking rank." "I am tracking rank," she said, "among other things." She found a position near the south wall, approximately 1 meter from the nearest shelf, and she stayed there. She did not touch anything. She watched. I went back to my audit. I want to explain the audit, because most people's eyes glaze when I mention it, and I have learned over 9 years that this is because most people do not understand what supply is actually for. They think supply is a counting function. You count the things, you make sure the count is right, and you replace what's missing. That is a description of supply the way moving air is a description of weather, technically accurate, missing everything that matters. The audit is a conversation between the unit and itself. Every form that comes across my counter tells me something about the state of the people generating it, their equipment, their health, their operational tempo, the informal trades and transfers happening in the background that never quite make it into the official ledger. A supply sergeant who is only counting things is failing. A supply sergeant who is reading things is doing the job. After 9 years, I could walk into almost any unit's supply cage, read the last 3 months of requisition forms, and give you a detailed picture of how that unit was actually functioning. Not how it was functioning on paper, not how it was functioning in the CO's weekly report, but how it was actually functioning in the 12 hours between midnight and noon when the forms got filed, and the supplies moved, and the informal economy of a military unit went about its daily business of keeping people alive. This is not a boast. It is the job description as I understand it. Velanath watched me work through the audit for 40 minutes without speaking. I had categorized her by that point as a professional, someone who understood that observation and interruption were different activities and that mixing them degraded both. I found this restful. Then she said, "You are writing on the forms by hand." "The terminal's been down for 6 days," I said. "Parts are coming on the resupply convoy Thursday." "But you continue the process." "Supplies don't wait for terminals." She wrote something in the air. I mean that literally. She had some kind of implant or interactive surface I couldn't see in her palm, and she would touch it occasionally with 2 fingers in a way that suggested she was recording something. I found later that the Sethali call this process sethanol, which means approximately the ongoing inscription of what is true. They do it constantly and without ceremony, the way some people breathe through their mouths without noticing. I finished the audit at 1600, which is late. I had been at it since 6:30. I put the forms in their stacks, filed the ones that were complete, set aside the ones that needed follow-up, and I made a pot of coffee on the burner in the corner because the mess was closed, and I had 3 more hours of work to do, and I had learned long ago not to approach that kind of work hungry or uncaffeinated. Velanath said, "You consumed no food during the audit." "I had a protein bar at 900, I said. "Before I arrived." "Before you arrived," I confirmed. "Is that typical for your unit?" I considered the question. "For me," I said, "not across the board." She noted that 2-finger inscription. I poured my coffee and went back to work. The follow-up stack contained 11 forms. 7 were standard, shortfalls in consumables, replacement requests for worn equipment, 1 medical supply draw I needed to verify against the corpsman's log. The remaining 4 were a particular kind of form that I handled differently from the others, and which I had been handling differently for approximately 7 weeks. I will explain the 4 forms, because they are what this story is actually about. When soldiers need something, gear, medical supplies, food supplements, replacement kit of any kind, they fill out a Form 7, which is a standard requisition. The Form 7 has a field at the top right that says Requesting Party and a field below it that says Reason for Request. Both fields are mandatory. The Reason field is free text. You can write what you like within reason, and most people write something functional. Boot sole delaminated, ration supplement, physical training demand increase. Replacement glove left hand lost in field exercise. The forms come to me and I process them and the supplies go out. 7 weeks ago I noticed a pattern. There was a soldier in 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, Private First Class Ren Cashew, who had not filed a Form 7 in 4 months. Not one. In a unit of 83 people, that is unusual. The average over a 4-month window for a private in a forward operating environment is 11 to 14 forms. Equipment wears. Rations vary. Boots fail. Medical needs arise. 11 to 14 is normal. 0 is not normal. I pulled his record. Nothing in the system indicated he'd been issued anything outside the standard load for 4 months, which meant either he was drawing from somewhere I wasn't tracking, which, in my cage, I would have found, or he was going without. I ran the math. A private first class's standard issue load covers maybe 80% of what a soldier in the field actually needs over a 4-month period, assuming moderate operational tempo. The remaining 20% is covered by Form 7 requisitions or by informal distribution. A squadmate shares a ration, a corpsman lends a supply, someone passes along a spare pair of gloves. Informal distribution doesn't always make it to the books, and that's fine. It's how units actually function. But Ren Cashew's informal distribution record was also thinner than it should have been. I started watching. Not obviously, I am very good at not being obvious. Supply work teaches you to observe without being observed, because the moment people know you're watching the informal economy changes. But I started paying close attention to how the unit's resources moved around him specifically. What I found was that he was not a recipient in the informal economy. He was the center of it. He was the one giving. Extra rations. He had a way of appearing at mess when portions were short and turning up with something from his own pack to fill the gap, doing it casually, without announcement, the way you might set down a cup of coffee you'd brewed for someone without making it a thing. Equipment. I tracked 3 instances in 7 weeks of him lending or outright transferring gear to squadmates who were short. 1 pair of cold-weather gloves, passed to a specialist named D-High after she'd lost hers in a river crossing. 1 fire starter kit, to a private named Asek whose was waterlogged. 1 headlamp with fresh batteries, when we'd had a run of dead cells in the supply chain, and 3 soldiers on 3rd Squad were navigating the evening perimeter check with failing equipment. None of it was in the books, all of it was from his own allocation. And none of his squadmates appeared to know he was doing it systematically. As far as they were concerned, Ren Cashew was just someone who happened to have the thing you needed when you needed it. Easy to be around. Never any friction. The kind of soldier units collect without quite noticing what they've collected. I noticed he was wearing a boot with a separated toe cap. I noticed it on a Monday when he came through the supply cage to drop off a form, not his own, a squadmate's, Hara's request for a replacement charge unit, and he was walking with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made their peace with an equipment failure and decided not to cause a problem. The toe cap was folded back at the front. He'd wrapped it with paracord to hold it in place, 2 passes around the toe box and knotted back against the sole. It was a workable solution. It was not a good solution, and it was not a solution that would work indefinitely, and he knew both of those things. He'd calculated that the benefit of not filing a form was worth more than the cost of walking on a boot wrapped in paracord, and he'd made the calculation and moved on. I did not ask him about it. I thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I picked up a blank Form 7 and I filled it out. In the requesting party field, I wrote my own name, because the form requires a requesting party and I am a requesting party for the supply cage generally. I order things for general pool use all the time, and this would be logged accordingly. In the reason for request field I considered, for perhaps 30 seconds, what to write. I could have written something functional, boot combat size 10.5 replacement. That would have been accurate and unremarkable. I almost wrote it. My pencil was on the field. Then I wrote, QTY, 1 boot combat size 10.5 reason, because he won't ask. I filed it in my own stack, processed it through the cage's internal ledger under a general maintenance line item I use for base equipment purposes, and I put the boot on his bunk that evening via the duty runner, with a slip that said it had come in mislabeled and been redirected per standing supply protocol, which is a sentence that is technically not untrue and also explains nothing, which is exactly the amount of explanation the situation required. That was 7 weeks ago. The notation had stayed. Every form I filed on his behalf since then said the same thing, because he won't ask. Not because I planned to keep using it, I hadn't planned anything. It was just the most accurate description of the reason for the requisition, and I try to be accurate. The 4 forms in my follow-up stack that Tuesday afternoon represented the current week's cycle. A thermal underlayer, size medium. He'd been wearing the same underlayer since intake and they don't last forever, and I'd watched him stop wearing it 3 weeks ago when the temperature hadn't quite dropped enough to require it. This was not evidence of good equipment management. It was evidence of someone conserving a resource they knew was failing, because they decided not to replace it, and they wanted to get everything they could out of what remained. A ration supplement, full protein pack, 5-day supply. He was running a caloric deficit I could see in his draw records and in the informal record of what he'd been giving away. A pair of gaiters, because his were cracking at the buckle loops and he'd been reinforcing them with strips of adhesive tape from the medical kit, which is a solution that works for approximately 10 days and then doesn't. And a new paracord kit, because the paracord he'd been using on everything from equipment repairs to tent rigging to boot repair had gotten short enough that I could see him making calculations about which task got the remaining length and which task would have to wait. On each of the 4 forms, I wrote my name in the requesting party field. On each of the 4 forms, I wrote the same thing in the reason field, because he won't ask. I processed them. I set aside the filled supplies for delivery to his bunk the following morning. Velanath had been watching me work through the follow-up stack for 40 minutes. She had not spoken once. The amber eyes tracked each form as I set it down, read it, and moved on. Her 2-finger inscription ran almost constantly during this period. I could tell by the slight movement of her wrist even when I wasn't looking directly at her. When I set down the 4th form, she said, "You wrote the same notation on all 4. "I did," I said. "What does it mean?" I looked at her. The half-light through the corrugated panels was going orange now with the late afternoon, and it caught the iridescence in her skin and made it look like she was standing inside a very mild fire. Her expression was what I had come to understand, over the course of the afternoon, was her neutral expression. A kind of focused calm that I suspected was not actually neutral, but was rather a form of very controlled attention, the Sethali equivalent of sitting forward in a chair. "It's self-explanatory," I said. "It is not self-explanatory to me," she said. "I have read 314 of your Form 7 requisitions in the last 4 hours. She had done this quickly and silently while I worked, moving along the shelf where I keep the completed files in chronological order, reading each form without touching the form beneath it. The reason field on every other form contains a functional description, an item in a stated condition with a stated tactical requirement. These 4 forms contain a reason that describes not the physical need, but the internal state of the party on whose behalf the requisition is filed. That is a significant departure from your own established pattern." I thought about how to answer that. I am not a man who talks about things easily. 9 years in supply has reinforced the tendency. Supply work is about things, their count and condition and location, and the precision of thing language had always come more naturally to me than people language. But I was also, it occurred to me, talking to someone who had just read 314 forms in 4 hours and had identified the right 4 to ask about, which is a kind of competence I respect in any observer, whatever species. "He's a private in 3rd Squad," I said. "He's been here 6 months. He gives away more than he keeps: equipment, food, time. If someone in his squad needs something, he finds a way to get it to them. He doesn't file for his own needs. I don't think he considers his own needs as something he's entitled to put on a form. So I file for him." Velanath's 2-finger inscription, longer than usual. "He does not know," she said. "No. You have not told him." "No." "Why not?" I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, which is what happens when you let a conversation run past the point you expected. I drank it cold anyway. Because if I told him, he'd feel like he owed me something, and then he'd spend energy paying back a debt that doesn't exist, and that energy should go to his squad, or to himself, which is the part he's less good at. Either way, the debt would cost him something, and the whole point is that it shouldn't cost him anything. She noted that the inscription was very long this time. She held her palm open for several seconds after she finished, looking at what she'd written, though from where I stood I couldn't see any surface or text, just her palm and the focused amber attention she was directing at it. "In the Sethali Accord," she said, "a resource allocation made without the knowledge of the recipient is classified as either deceptive or compensatory. Deceptive allocation is a violation of the Accord's core resource exchange framework. Compensatory allocation occurs when the allocator has documented evidence that the recipient's stated preferences would create resource deficits harmful to the collective. Compensatory allocation requires documentation and formal review by two senior allocators before it can be initiated. We call it supply, I said. You call it supply, she repeated, and I had the sense that she was turning the word over, examining it from an angle I hadn't considered and was not sure she'd expected to find. But your process here is not typical supply. The other 310 forms are supply. These 4 forms are something else. You are not filling a gap between what was requested and what is available. You are filling a gap between what is needed and what will ever be requested. The distinction matters to me. It matters to me too, I said. It's what the job is for. Velanath turned away from me and looked out the supply cage's small window, which looked out onto the base's main throughway and showed, in the early evening light, a line of soldiers moving from the training ground back toward the barracks. I watched her watch them. She was looking for something specific. I could tell by the way her eyes tracked steadily rather than scanning. After a moment, she found it. That is him, she said. It was not a question. I looked. Ren Cashew was in the line, middle of the column, in a position I had also noticed was almost always the middle, close enough to either end to be useful, far enough from both to avoid being conspicuous. He was talking to the soldier on his left, a specialist named Hara who had been short on ration packs the previous week, and who was, I noticed, now wearing a pair of gaiters I recognized as a pair I'd sent out 3 days ago via duty runner, logged as general pool redistribution. Hara had needed them. The requisition for them had come from Ren Cashew on Hara's behalf, filed in Hara's name, correct in every field. I hadn't said any of this to Velanath. She had found it herself, in the 314 forms and the line of soldiers through a small dusty window, working in whatever computational patience the Sethali bring to observation. Yes, I said, that's him. He does not appear depleted, she said. He doesn't, I agreed. But your records indicate he is operating below standard allocation on multiple categories simultaneously. He is. How does he sustain that? I thought about how to answer honestly. Practice, I said finally. He's built a version of getting through a day that costs him less than it costs most people. Not because he's more efficient at converting resources, he's not. He just doesn't place himself at the top of the priority list. And over time that becomes a kind of skill, or a kind of habit so deep it looks like a skill. You get good at going without. You start not noticing the absence of things you never expected to have. You view that as a skill, she said, and her voice carried the particular flatness I was learning to interpret as a genuine question rather than skepticism, the Sethali equivalent of a raised eyebrow. I view it as a thing he does, I said. I don't have a strong opinion on whether it's good or bad as a thing. I think it means he's not getting enough sleep, probably, and not eating enough, definitely, and that his equipment is aging faster than it should because he's not replacing it on schedule. Which is my problem to solve, not his. His job is to take care of his squad. Mine is to take care of the books and the things in them. That's what supply is for. She watched me for a moment. Then you take care of him. I take care of the books, I said. The 2-finger inscription. She held it longer than any previous one, the wrist still, 2 fingers barely moving. I have a question, she said. That is outside my standard documentation protocol. Ask. Why does he not ask? I set down my coffee cup. I thought about Ren Cashew walking into the supply cage 3 weeks ago to drop off Hara's form, the boot wrapped in paracord, the careful, deliberate walk of someone who'd made an accommodation to a problem and was now carrying it so smoothly that most people wouldn't see it. I thought about the way he'd looked around the supply cage when he came in, not looking for anything specific, or not appearing to, and how he'd said good afternoon to me in the particular easy way he had, like he was genuinely glad to see anyone who treated him ordinarily, without debt or expectation. It was the voice of someone who had learned to be glad for small things, because he decided the large things were not things he was entitled to want. I don't know, I said. I've watched him for 7 weeks and I have a guess, but it's only a guess. People who don't ask are usually operating on a private accounting that I can't fully see. I can see the results of it. I can see the gaps it creates, but the internal ledger is theirs. What is your guess? She said. I think he believes that asking costs something, I said. Not money, not standing. He doesn't appear to be concerned with how people see him. Something internal. Some currency he's tracking carefully that has nothing to do with the formal economy. And he's decided he'd rather run low than spend it on himself. He'll spend it on other people without thinking twice. On himself it costs too much. And you, she said, you do not share this belief. I'm supply, I said. My entire job is to make asking easy, to remove the friction from the space between need and the thing that fills it. If I believed asking costs something that mattered, I'd be in the wrong job. She turned back to the window. The line of soldiers had passed. The throughway was empty now in the evening light, long shadows from the perimeter posts reaching across the pale packed dirt. I will need to document these 4 forms specifically, she said. They represent a category of allocation behavior that the Accord's standard resource documentation framework does not account for. Document whatever you need, I said. The forms are in the public file. Yes, she said, but the notation, because he won't ask. I will need to classify it within the Accord's framework, and the framework does not have a ready category. Classify it however makes sense to you. She was quiet for a moment. In Sethali, she said, there is a word, velanath sui. It translates approximately as the act of perceiving another's need before they have named it, and supplying it without requiring the naming. It is considered a form of precision in our culture, a high-order observational skill. In the Accord, velanath sui is practiced by senior allocators in times of resource scarcity, operating under formal institutional frameworks with peer review and documentation requirements. She paused. It is unusual to find it operating informally. Without framework, between a resource specialist and a junior soldier who does not know it is occurring. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not a man who is comfortable with things being named, especially things I do without thinking about them. I picked up the follow-up stack and placed it in the filed bin, because the work was done and the bin was where done work went, and that was a thing I could do without having to decide what to say. The name of your word, I said after a moment, velanath. Yes, she said. That's also your name. A pause, the first genuine pause I'd heard from her, a beat longer than her processing pauses. Yes, she said again, and something in the flatness of her voice shifted very slightly, the way a clinical readout shifts when you've touched a value you weren't expecting to touch. Among my people, observer designations are drawn from the practice the observer is assigned to document. I was assigned to document resource allocation behavior. My designation reflects the practice I was believed most suited to observe. I looked at her. She looked back, the vertical pupils wide in the diminishing light. How long have you been doing this? I asked, observing. 42 years, she said. This is my 16th human installation. And the other 15. She held her palm open for a moment, not inscribing, just holding it. In 15 installations, she said, I have documented a great deal of resource allocation behavior, standard requisition patterns, informal distribution economies, black market item flows, hoarding behaviors under conditions of scarcity, prioritization hierarchies, who gets supplied first when there is not enough for everyone and by what logic, waste patterns, overdrawing patterns. The full range of human behavior around resource access, which is, I can tell you, very wide. She closed her palm. I have not documented this before. I went and poured out the cold coffee and rinsed the cup. It's just 4 forms, I said. Yes, she said, it is 4 forms and also it is not. She left at 1800. I worked until 2030 and then I went to bed. She came back the next morning at 7:30 before the audit, and she was there every day for the 3 weeks that followed. She did not help with anything. She did not ask questions that interfered with the work. She stood near the south wall and she inscribed and she watched, and after the first 3 days I mostly forgot she was there, which is the state that supply work eventually induces in everyone who observes it. The work is ongoing enough and unglamorous enough that observers either leave or dissolve into the background, and Velanath had the patience and the stillness for background. What I noticed over those 3 weeks was that she was learning the forms. Not learning to read them. She'd read 314 in 4 hours on the first day. She was learning to read them the way I read them. Not as individual documents, but as a continuous record of a living system. The same way you learn to read a river not by looking at any one section of water, but by watching the whole stretch of it over enough time to understand which ripples are permanent and which are temporary, and what the permanent ones mean. By the end of the second week, she was filing the completed forms in the right bins without being asked. Not processing them. She never touched the active stack, but taking the completed and filed forms from the temporary pile on the left end of the counter, where I set them when I'm done, and placing them in the right year, right month, right platoon position on the shelf. Perfect placement every time, after watching me do it for 9 days. I did not comment on this. She did not comment on it. It was supply work, and supply work gets done. There was one afternoon in the second week when the terminal came back online, the parts had arrived, the tech had done his job, and I spent 4 hours entering 7 weeks of handwritten forms into the system. Velanath watched the entire process. She did not ask questions while I worked. When I finished, she said, "The electronic record and the paper record are now congruent." "Yes," I said. "They were not congruent for 7 weeks." "Correct." "And the unit functioned normally during that time?" "Yes." "The paper forms were sufficient?" I looked up. "The paper forms were the forms," I said. The terminal is a tool for managing the forms at scale. When the tool goes down, you use the forms directly. The work doesn't stop because a tool stops. She inscribed. "In the Accord's logistical systems," she said, "a terminal outage at a forward installation triggers a supply freeze until the terminal is restored. No new allocations are processed. The reasoning is that without a congruent record, errors compound." "Errors compound with a freeze too," I said. "They just compound silently. People go without and nobody knows about it until someone takes a hard inventory weeks later and finds out how short everyone had gotten." I turned back to the terminal. "I prefer errors I can see, paper forms I can see, silence I can't." She considered this for a long moment. "You view silence as an error state," she said. "In a supply cage," I said, "silence means someone needs something and hasn't said so. That's always an error, whether it's the terminal or the person." She inscribed for a long time after that, and I let her. I kept filing the 4-form cycle. Not always 4, sometimes 2, sometimes 6, depending on the week. I adjusted the quantities based on what I could see through the cage's records and what I could infer from watching the informal economy of the unit move around Ren Cashew, the way water moves around a still object in a current shaping around him without acknowledging the shape it was making. When his pack looked well stocked, I pulled back. When the squad had a hard week and he'd given more than usual, I filed accordingly. The notation was always the same, because he won't ask. I was not making a statement with it. It was the most accurate description of the reason for the requisition, and I try to be accurate in the reason field. If you are not accurate in the reason field, you are telling the form a story instead of telling the form the truth, and the form will tell that story back to you later, usually at an inconvenient time. I had learned this early and I had not forgotten it. In the second week, Velanath said, "The notation is consistent." "Yes," I said. It has not changed across 12 separate requisitions. No. Is that intentional? I thought about it. It's accurate, I said. The reason hasn't changed, he still won't ask. Every time the reason is the same, the notation is the same. In Sethali allocation documentation, she said, a recurring notation of this kind would be flagged as a systematic pattern requiring formal review. The assumption would be that a need requiring repeated compensatory allocation represents a systemic failure in the standard allocation framework, which should be corrected at the framework level rather than managed case by case. That's one way to handle it, I said. What is another way? You manage it case by case, I said, because the systemic failure isn't in the framework. The framework is fine. The gap is between the framework and the person. The person has decided the framework isn't for him. You can try to change the person, or you can try to be the bridge between the person and the framework, for as long as you have access to both. She inscribed, "You prefer the bridge." I prefer what works, I said. Trying to change the person takes time and generates friction and usually doesn't work, and in the meantime the person is still walking on a boot wrapped in paracord. And the boot matters. The boot matters, that's why there's a form for it. She was quiet for a while after that. Then, you said the gap is between the framework and the person, but the framework exists for the person. If the person will not use it, the gap is between the person and themselves. I put down my pencil. Yes, I said, that's right. And you bridge that too. I picked the pencil back up. That's the job, I said. She looked at the shelf of completed forms, 3 months of them, filed in order, the paper soft with handling, and the ink gone slightly pale with the dust that gets into everything in a forward installation. In 42 years, she said, I have not met an allocator who described the gap between a person and themselves as falling within the allocator's responsibility. Most allocators I know would agree with you, I said. That's between the person and their sergeant or the person and their corpsman or the person and themselves, full stop. Supply is supply. You manage things, not people. But you do not hold this view. I set down the pencil again. I hold the view that things and people are the same problem, I said, viewed from 2 different ends of the supply chain. At my end, it's forms and bins and inventory counts. At the person's end, it's a boot that's falling apart and a reason why they haven't filed. Those are the same thing. If I only look at my end, I miss half of what I'm managing. She inscribed, steadily, for a long time, the way someone writes when they're capturing something they don't want to lose. In the 3rd week, Velanath asked me, do you believe he is aware that someone is supplying him? I thought about it carefully before answering. I think he suspects something's off, I said. He's not stupid, and he's been in the field long enough to know how supply chains work. Equipment showing up outside standard channels, consistently, in exactly the categories where he's running low. He'll have noticed the pattern by now, if he hasn't since the beginning. And if he has noticed, he's decided not to look directly at it, I said, because looking directly at it would require him to decide what to do about it, and his options are to ask about it, which costs the internal currency I mentioned, or to acknowledge it and feel the weight of the debt, which also costs. So he's decided it's a supply chain anomaly, and he's letting it be an anomaly. It's easier. You are comfortable with being an anomaly, she said. I'm comfortable with the supplies getting to him, I said. The anomaly part is administrative. She inscribed. You are not managing for his gratitude, she said. No. Or his awareness. No. You are managing only for the gap between his need and his willingness to name it. That's the job, I said. She held her palm open for a long moment after that, longer than usual. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different, still flat, still precise, but carrying something underneath it that I hadn't heard there before. Not warmth exactly. A kind of weight, as though the observation had cost something. "Sergeant Vaughn," she said, "I have 42 years of allocation documentation. I have records of every major resource behavior pattern in 16 human installations across 4 decades of contact. I have a classification framework with 947 distinct categories of observed behavior." She closed her palm. "I am going to have to create a new category." "For the 4 forms," I said. "For the 4 forms," she said, "and for what the 4 forms represent." On the last day of the 3rd week, Ren Cashew was rotated out. The transfer orders came down on a Thursday morning. I saw them in the command packet when it came across the supply counter. Supply gets the command packet for billeting and equipment redistribution purposes, and the transfer orders are in it. He was moving to an installation 200 kilometers east, assigned to a unit that needed his particular combination of skills. In a way, the orders described in language that was specific, and also, in the way of military transfer orders everywhere, managed to say very little. He had 4 days to prepare. Velanath had been in the supply cage when I read the orders. She saw me stop on that page. She did not ask what I was reading. She watched me set the packet down and pick up the day's work instead, and she inscribed steadily and said nothing. I watched the informal economy of the unit shift around his departure the way it shifts around any loss, quietly, without announcement, the gaps he had been filling becoming visible in the 3 days before he left as he wound down the giving in a systematic way I recognized as deliberate. He was not going to leave debts. He was not going to leave people short in ways that could be traced to his absence. He was, as far as I could tell from the outside, completing a careful handover of the informal responsibilities he'd accumulated without ever formally accepting them, finding alternate paths for each one, redirecting each thread of informal supply to someone who could carry it forward. He did this without telling anyone he was doing it, which meant that most of the people it happened to would experience it as a run of small good luck in the days following his departure, and would not connect the luck to him. I found 2 Form 7s in my stack on his second-to-last day, both filed in his handwriting, both on behalf of other people. A new thermal underlayer for OSSEC, who'd been going without. A medic-grade blister kit for a private named Yen who had a foot condition that had been quietly worsening since the last river crossing. Both were correctly filled out. Both had accurate reason fields. Neither one said anything about Ren Cashew. I processed them both. I thought about the internal currency he was spending on people who would never know the cost in the 4 days before he left a place that had gotten something from him without quite knowing what. I thought about that for a while, and then I got back to work, because the audit stack does not care what you are thinking about. He came through the supply cage on the morning he was leaving to return his borrowed gear, a field tool kit and a portable charge unit he'd signed out from the general pool 6 weeks prior. He set them on the counter and said, "Returning field kit and charge unit, Sergeant," and I checked them in, verified the condition good on both, better than expected on the charge unit, which suggested he'd been maintaining it on his own time, and I initialed the return form and said, "Safe travels, Cashew." He picked up his pack. He turned to go. He paused at the door. He did not turn around. He stood with his back to me for approximately 3 seconds, and I could see in the set of his shoulders the particular stillness of someone deciding something. He had a full pack, properly loaded. He was traveling correctly supplied for once, which gave me the specific satisfaction of a ledger that balances on the right side. "Sergeant," he said, "supply chain anomalies usually cluster by category. When they don't cluster, it means they're not anomalies." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I don't know if this needs to be said out loud. I'm going to say it anyway. Thank you." He left. The door of the supply cage swung and settled, and the morning dust drifted in through the gap at the bottom. I stood with the initialed return form in my hand. I stood with it for longer than you stand with an initialed return form. Then I put it in the completed bin. Velanath said from the south wall. He knew. Yes, I said. For how long? I don't know, I said. Probably most of it, maybe from the beginning. He said nothing. No. Why? I set the empty counter to rights, stacked the unprocessed forms on the left, the pending stack in the center, cleared the right side for returns. It is a thing I do at the start of every morning, and it takes about 45 seconds, and I have done it so many times it has become a form of thinking. Because saying something would have required him to receive it, I said, out loud between us, in a way that made it real in the space between two people rather than just in his own accounting. He wasn't ready to do that maybe ever, maybe just not until the end, I don't know. But he also couldn't leave without acknowledging it, because leaving without acknowledging it would have made it only his. Something he'd taken. And it wasn't only his. He knew that too. He knew what the forms were. He knew someone had to file them. Velanath was very still. The morning light through the corrugated panels was pale and clean, a bright, thin winter light that made everything look precisely like itself with no softening. She had her palm open. She was not inscribing. She was simply holding it open, the way you hold something that has just been placed in your hand, and you are not yet sure whether to close your fingers around it. The notation on the forms, she said, because he won't ask. You wrote it to explain the requisition. Yes. But it also describes him, generally, as a person. Yes. And it describes the reason you began filing on his behalf. Yes. And it describes the reason he did not file on his own behalf. Yes. And it describes the reason he said nothing until the last possible moment. Yes. And it describes what he overcame to say it. I looked up from the counter. She was watching me with the vertical pupils wide in the morning light. Yes, I said. One notation can cover a lot of ground if you pick the right one. She closed her palm slowly. I have completed my observation period at this installation, she said. My report will be filed with the Accord Review Board within 8 standard days. I am required to inform you that individual observations may be published in the Accord's research corpus if the board determines they have academic value. That's fine, I said. Sergeant Vaughn. She paused, and in the pause I heard the weight again, the thing underneath the precision. I must tell you that the Accord's classification system does not contain a category for what you do. The closest framework, compensatory allocation, requires institutional sanction, peer review, and documentation of harm prevention. What you do has none of those structures around it. It is informal. It is invisible to everyone except the recipient, who chose not to look directly at it. And it worked. She smoothed her observer's sash with the precise two-handed gesture I had come to recognize as her version of gathering herself. I will have to create the category. What will you call it? I said. In Sethali Velanath Sui, she said. In standard, I had planned to use the word compensatory. As a functional description, it is accurate. She held her palm open one last time and closed it. But I think I will file it under a different word. I will file it under courage. I picked up my grease pencil. I had an audit to run, and the morning was already getting away from me. Velanath, I said. Yes. For what it's worth, the name. Yours, it fits you. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I have been told that once or twice in 42 years. She straightened the sash a second time, a gesture that had nothing to do with the sash. You are the first human who has noticed. She left. I turned to the audit and started working through the stack. The first form in the pile was a Form 7 that I had not put there. It had no processing stamp. It had no case number. It had been filled out in handwriting I recognized immediately, the handwriting from the return forms, from the careful, deliberate script of someone who developed precise penmanship, the way people develop any skill they use to keep things in order. Requesting party field, blank. Reason for request field in Ren Cashu's hand. Boot, combat size 10.5 reason, for the next one. He must have slipped it in on his way through the cage, when I was checking in the field tool kit and the charge unit. The cage counter is long and I was at one end and he'd been at the other, and I had been focused on the returned equipment and not watching the far end of the counter, which is not something that happens often but which happens. I sat with the form for a moment. He had left me a requisition for a boot in the right size, in the right format, with a reason that any supply sergeant paying attention would understand, for whoever came next, whoever would be standing in a forward cage 6 months from now wearing a boot wrapped in paracord and deciding not to file. It was technically a valid Form 7 in every field but the processing stamp and case number. I could process it. The size was a common one. The reason field was clear enough for anyone who'd been paying attention, and in this cage I have always been paying attention. I sat with it for a long time. Then I picked up my grease pencil, wrote the case number across the top, and put it in the active stack. Velanath's report was published 14 months later as one section of a larger Accord research corpus, Studies in Non-Standard Resource Behavior in Multi-Species Military Contexts, Volume 7. I know this because Colonel Marin received a formal notification from the Accord Review Board, which she forwarded to me with a note that said only, "Thought you should see this." The section was titled in Standard, Velanath Sui, an observed practice of preemptive allocation in human forward operating units, a case study in informal precision. It was 46 pages. I read all of it over 2 evenings in the supply cage, after the day's work was done, with the burner coffee and the late corrugated panel light. My name appeared in it 14 times, described throughout as the primary allocation specialist. Ren Cashu's name appeared once, in a footnote on page 31, in a sentence that described him as the recipient of sustained allocation actions, and noted without further elaboration that he had demonstrated awareness of the allocation prior to its formal acknowledgement, and upon departure initiated a reciprocal allocation of comparable structure directed toward an anticipated future recipient. Velanath's analysis of the notation, because he won't ask, ran for 11 pages. She had cross-referenced it against 700 years of Sethali resource documentation pulled from the Accord's Central Archive. She had found 3 analogs in the entire corpus. All 3 were in contexts of extreme resource scarcity. All 3 were institutional and formally sanctioned. All 3 had been initiated by senior allocators acting under peer review with documented need assessments. The informality of mine was, she wrote, the element that made it interesting. Her conclusion read, "The notation, because he won't ask, represents a form of allocation reasoning that the Accord's existing frameworks do not accommodate, and that represents a meaningful gap in those frameworks. The gap is this. The frameworks assume that resource need enters the allocation system through the act of naming, that a need unspoken is a need not yet real from the perspective of the allocating institution. This case demonstrates that a human allocator operating informally, without institutional framework or peer sanction, may treat the silence around a need as itself informative, as carrying, in some instances, more precise information than a stated request would carry. The silence is not absence. It is data. The skilled allocator reads the silence and acts on what the silence says. The Accord would benefit from examining whether its formal allocation frameworks have been systematically blind, across 7 centuries of resource documentation, to the needs of those members of any community who are least likely to name what they need. This is not a small question. It may be the largest question I have encountered in 42 years of observation, and I encountered it on a Tuesday afternoon in a forward supply cage, watching a human soldier read a requisition form. I read that paragraph 4 times. I am not a philosopher. I do not generally find that supply work gives rise to large questions. But I sat with it for a while in the supply cage in the late afternoon light, the corrugated panels going gold, and I thought about Ren Cashew walking out of a supply cage 200 kilometers east with his pack correctly loaded, and about a boot with a separated toe cap reinforced with paracord, and about a Form 7 that had found its way into my active stack without a processing stamp, and without a case number, and with a reason that fit on one line. A private named Dehi came in to return a generator cable and pick up a replacement fuel cell, and I processed the return and the requisition and initialed both forms, and Dehi said, "Thanks, Sergeant," and I said, "Safe," and she left. I put the forms in their bins. The audit stack had 22 forms in it. I picked up the grease pencil. The fourth form from the top was a Form 7 with no processing stamp and no case number, filed in the same handwriting as all the anonymous Form 7 that find their way onto my counter when someone needs something and isn't sure how to ask for it. A handwriting I was beginning to recognize as a type rather than a person. Careful, slightly cramped, the letters formed with more precision than they needed to be, the handwriting of someone who takes the form seriously because the form is one of the few official channels they feel they have access to. A corporal in 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, newly transferred in. The reason field said, Gators size 9 for training. Also, new to the unit, not sure what I need yet. It was 2 reasons, technically. Neither of them precise in the way the form preferred. I read it twice. Then I wrote the case number across the top, and I wrote a note on the back of the form, not in a designated field, just in the white space that said, "Stop in. We'll figure it out together." I put it in the active stack. Outside the supply cage, the afternoon was doing what it does at the end of a long day, turning the packed dirt of the throughway a warmer color than it actually was, making the perimeter posts look briefly like they were made of something valuable. It does not mean anything. It is just light doing what light does at that angle. But I have found over 9 years that it is easier to do this work in that light than in any other. There is something about it that makes the gap between what people need and what they will bring themselves to ask for seem smaller, not because the gap is smaller, but because the light does what it can. The work is always the same. A stack on the left, a bin on the right, and somewhere in between, the ongoing business of filling in what people cannot bring themselves to name. The forms are finite. The audit is finite. At the end of each day, there is a pile in the completed bin that wasn't there in the morning, and somewhere out on this base, and 200 kilometers east, and in the pages of a 46-page report that a Sethali Accord observer will cite for the next 3 decades in every course she teaches on resource behavior, the gap is a little smaller than it was. I picked up the next form, I read the reason field, I picked up the grease pencil. Because they won't ask, and someone has to know that and show up every morning and be the bridge and hold the books on the silence and not make it cost anything. That is the job. I have found no better description of it. In 9 years and 4 postings, and 314 forms read on a Tuesday afternoon by someone with vertical pupils and 42 years of patient observation. Because he won't ask, write it down, put it in the bin. Start again tomorrow.